Yeah, we'll just stop for a second and then welcome to Bellingham Voices. I'm Marie Marchand. On today's show, I am happy to welcome astronaut Wendy Lawrence. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Marie.
I'm really happy that you're here, and I have loved stars and space since I was a toddler. So I'm actually a little starstruck to be here with you, right?
You're
so
kind
to
to
speak.
say that.
I'm almost speechless, but this conversation wouldn't go well if I was speechless. So,
Obviously.
So I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure that the people watching at home are just as curious as I am about your life and work. So I wanted to start out with the beginning and to see what made you first want to become an astronaut.
Well, I wish I had an original story, but for astronauts around my age, my story is not unique. For us, it was truly all about the Apollo program. We were not quite old enough to remember Mercury and then the Gemini program, but as Apollo started and NASA was focused on sending humans to the moon, we were definitely paying attention. Each and every one of us can tell you exactly where we were when Apollo 11 landed, and excuse me, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin got out to take those very historic and first steps on the moon. We were in front of our black and white televisions at home. We were watching that grainy video come back from the surface of the moon, and it truly was an aha moment for us, and a moment that really changed the direction of our lives. We looked at that and thought, wow, what an amazing thing to be able to do. And that's what I want to do when I grow up. So for me, in July 1969, I was 10 years old, growing up in Southern California. I don't quite remember it this way, but as my mother tells the version of the story, she said, you were about a foot away from the television and you turned around and confidently proclaimed to the rest of us that you were going to be an astronaut when you grew up, that you wanted to fly in space, and that's what you were going to do.
Wow. What kind of barriers did you face, or even discrimination, being a woman in that field, in maybe the university in science and engineering, or military, or NASA?
So I grew up in a Navy family. My mother's father went to the Naval Academy, was a naval aviator. In fact, he was stationed at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in 1943, and used to tell me stories about flying around Whatcom County and using Mount Baker as his navigational aid to find his way back to Whidbey. My dad went to the Naval Academy, was a naval aviator. In fact, my parents met at the Naval Academy when my dad was a student there. So as I pondered my path, I guess it was just pretty easy to go with family tradition. My senior year in high school, the Naval Academy opened its doors to women for the first time. So knowing that many astronauts had gone to the Naval Academy, had studied engineering there, had gone on to learn how to fly in the Navy and served as naval aviators, I thought that would be a pretty good path to take. And I also wanted to be a pilot as well. So I applied, got accepted, and was in the second class of women to be at the Naval Academy. So certainly that transition was still a little rocky. Many of my male classmates and upperclassmen as well did not want to have women there. They did not feel that we belonged. But I was there to prove otherwise, and all I asked for was the opportunity to show them that I had what it took to serve in the Navy. I knew probably better than most of them the sacrifices involved in serving, since I was the third generation in my family to go there. And the Naval Academy gave me a great education. They gave me many opportunities. I finished high enough in my class to go off to pilot training. And again, all I asked for was the opportunity to prove myself, and my flight instructors gave me that opportunity. So honestly, I don't feel like I faced a lot of barriers as a woman. More than anything for me, my lack of height has been my obstacle. The list of what I could fly in the Navy was pretty short. A very long list of aircraft that I didn't fit in. So fortunately for me, I fit in most of the helicopters, and so that was the path I chose to take in the Navy, was to become a helicopter pilot. But at my squadrons there, I did 2 flying tours in Norfolk. I can honestly say that I didn't really face a lot of discrimination as a woman. I felt accepted, and I think part of that was because in the Navy, helicopter pilots tend to be ranked a little bit below the jet aviators. Think of Top Gun. But we loved our job, and we had a strong sense of camaraderie, and it was a very good environment for me.
So in the movies, that's the only relation I have to space, right? But in the movies they talk about, is this person fit for space? And so I wanted to ask what kind of testing you have to go through, and then what sort of intelligence do you need? Because we used to focus on, IQ, like people were smart if they had IQ, but we're kind of moving to the understanding of there's different types of intelligences. And so I'm wondering about the testing and then the disposition or intelligence that people have to become astronauts.
Well, fortunately, the physical testing requirements have been reduced over the years. I have an immense amount of admiration for the people who applied for the Mercury program, because their testing was extensive. Pretty much anything the doctors could think of to test, they did. A lot of poking and prodding, as I like to call it. Heat chambers where you had to sit in a room at 120 degrees to see how you would fare for hours at a time. Cold exposure as well. So NASA learned over the years, we need healthy people, but they don't have to be perfect physical specimens. So when I went through the selection process in 1991, honestly, the physical exams were not that much beyond what I had to do to stay qualified to be a pilot in the Navy. A few extra exams, some deeper analysis of how your heart functions and some of your other internal organs, but really not all that bad. The requirements are a little bit more stringent now that we have crew members living for 5-6 months at a time on the International Space Station. They have some additional testing requirements that they go through, but not as bad as what the Mercury guys went through. God bless them. And NASA's also learned a lot about what type of person is going to be successful as a member of a crew assigned to a space mission. Natural IQ, is that really the determining factor? No, it's not. Your ability to work well with others, because you are one member of a team, and the team has to work together to accomplish the mission. So that really is a significant component. Can you function well on a team? And that takes a type of personality where the team is first and foremost, accomplishing the mission is right there as well, and you don't necessarily care if you get the individual credit. It's more important to you that the team succeeds and the team is recognized. You also have to be adaptable, you have to be flexible, because trust me, nothing goes right 100% of the time on a mission. And so you've got to be able to roll with the punches, so to speak, and kind of regroup and think about how we're going to solve this problem, work with your mission control team to do that. So I think also NASA looks for people who have a proven track record, that you've studied a particular discipline in college, you've gone off to a job related to that subject, you have a demonstrated ability of taking what you've learned and applying them to the particular challenges you might face in that field, and you can solve the problems. You can look around you, draw on the available resources, work with your team, and solve that problem and keep moving forward. So I wouldn't say that there's one factor over another. IQ certainly plays into it. I think, again, that proven performance can be related to some natural talents and abilities and smarts, so to speak, that you have. But it really, I think, boils down to your ability to function well as a member of a team.
Mm-hmm. It's starting to sound to me like NASA is progressive, I guess, in the sense, and has always been. I mean, welcoming of women, people of different races, people, different countries, and different, like, intelligences, like you're saying.
Think of Hidden Figures. Rise of the Rocket Girls by Nathalia Holt, talking about the human computers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Hidden Figures talks about the women who worked as human computers at Langley Research Facility in Hampton, Virginia. So I think NASA has always had the mindset we have a mission to accomplish. Who has the ability to help us do that? And if you proved that you had the ability, then you were accepted, because the focus really wasn't on the individual, it was on the team trying to accomplish the mission and ultimately getting the mission accomplished.
Wow. It almost sounds like from Star Trek, I'm in Next Generation, yeah. The idea of United Federation of Planets, you know, a place where we moved beyond monetary commerce. You know, is that the type of feeling that you got there? A futuristic feeling of humankind?
Well, I think the International Space Station program is a good example of it. We're trying. Are we there yet? No. Are we making progress? Certainly. The International Space Station has 5 space agencies participating in it. Obviously NASA, Russian Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, European and Canadian space agencies as well. So ultimately about 15 countries are participating in the program right now. And I think history will look back at the International Space Station and say its greatest accomplishment wasn't necessarily the engineering behind the development of the individuals of the modules that you then launched and put together in space. It was really the international collaboration, particularly when you look at the United States and Russia. I mean, countries that had been, in essence, at war against one another during the Cold War period, which that was my time in the Navy, and what was considered to be a Cold War warrior. We demonstrated the ability to move past that, to move past the differences in our political systems and beliefs, and truly take that sword and beat it into plowshares. Was it an easy partnership at the beginning? No, there were lots of fits and starts. There are still times where there are tensions in that partnership, but for the most part, the two sides have figured out how to work together and do it quite well and keep that program going. And it will probably continue for at least another 7 years, if not longer.
How did you communicate with the people? Are you multilingual?
The crews on board kind of jokingly call it Rushlish. So the cosmonauts study English, and actually the younger cosmonauts now tend to already know English. English, like in the world of commercial aviation, truly is the operational language. For the most part, all the control centers, with the exception of the Russians, operate in English. Crews are launched to and from the station on board the Russian-built Soyuz capsule. So communications while you're on board the Soyuz are in Russian. So the astronauts from all the other space agencies do study Russian as well. And so for crew members, particularly from Japan, it's really interesting for them. You know, they have to be fluent in English, and for the most part they already are, but then they have to learn Russian as well. So yes, the crew members do tend to end up being capable of speaking at least a couple of languages, if not more.
Wow. So the next question is my favorite question. I really am curious about what it was like the first time you went up and the first time you looked out the window and saw Earth.
Well, riding the rocket, as I like to say, never gets boring. Yes, there are simulators for that. You even do a recession in the centrifuge to understand what the G-force is going to be like, but there's nothing on Earth that comes near to accurately capturing the sensation of 6.5 million pounds of thrust as you ride the rocket. It's dramatic, it's dynamic. The sense of power and acceleration are just, as I like to say, dazzling and inescapable. You are painfully aware of the fact that you've got 3 Gs going right through your chest and it feels like somebody's sitting on you, but really a spectacular ride. So you always look forward to riding the rocket. Looking out the window, you know, it's really hard to capture in words. I always struggle to find an appropriate description, but I think each and every one of us who's had an opportunity to do that will tell you it's a very impactful moment. It's a very emotional moment. The previous administrator for NASA, Charlie Bolden, 4-time space shuttle astronaut, he's quick to say the first time he looked out the window, he started to cry because he was so moved by that experience. And he's also quick to say that it made him feel small and insignificant to look down at his home planet, to see it against all of space surrounding it, and realized that he was one of just a handful who'd had the opportunity to look out the window and look back at his home planet.
I can't imagine what a spiritual experience.
And for
That would
many,
be.
yes, but I think even for those who don't view it that way, it's fascinating to ask astronauts, cosmonauts alike, and I suspect even if you ask the Chinese astronauts who are called taikonauts, they would say the same thing. You could ask us the question independently of how that impacted us, and we all tend to give a similar answer, which is the way that we see Earth when we look out the window in the daytime part of the orbit, where the sunlight is so strong, even though the stars are there, we can't see them. The sunlight just overwhelms the incoming light from the stars. So what we see is Earth against this intensely black void of space that just seems like it wants to swallow up Earth. And so we all tend to come back and say the Earth looks small, or the Earth looks fragile. And we all tend to come back and say that we came away with this heightened sense of responsibility for taking care of our planet, because we are very, very, very aware of the fact, because of that perspective, that this is the only planet that we know how to live on now, and we better not screw it up.
Wow. Do you think that there's life on other planets similar to humanoid?
Obviously, we have explored so little of our world around us, our solar system around us, that my answer to that is I don't know how we can answer that question with either a yes or a no, and that's one of the reasons why we need to keep exploring. I suspect that yes, there's life out there. I would not be surprised if it's in a form that we aren't smart enough to recognize. And it could be that we don't know what to look for, that our view is so shaped by what we've seen down here on Earth that we haven't been able to think about it in a different way. And we're just now beginning to realize that there are different types of life even down here on planet Earth that aren't necessarily carbon-based. And I think that's giving the scientists a better understanding of different ways to think about the search for alien life, and to be prepared to find something that is radically different than anything that we've ever experienced down here on Earth and seen before.
Wow. How long have you spent in space aggregately?
Just a little over 50 days, which in the era of station astronauts now is not much at all. You have Russian cosmonauts who, when you add all their space flights together, have spent well over 800 days in space. Peggy Whitson is the leader for the U.S., and she's got well over 600 days in space when you add up her 3 station missions. So, yeah. So I'm not going to complain. I had 4 flights on the shuttle. It was fantastic. But truly now we have astronauts who go to space and live there, rather than just visiting space for short periods of time.
What was the most challenging thing about living in space, traveling to space?
So for a shuttle astronaut, since you were limited in the amount of time that you had on orbit, usually about 2 weeks, for me, it was trying to get everything done on a daily basis. Invariably, it seemed like you were always behind what we call the timeline, your plan for that day, and you were always desperately trying to get caught up. And so that tended to create a very long work day for you, a very short sleep period as a result. And so I always just felt like I got to keep going, I've got so much more that I need to do. And plus, you're a little selfish. You want to preserve some time at the end of the day where you can just park yourself in front of a window and watch the world go by.
Wow.
Because that's not something you can do on Earth. So my philosophy when I was in space was, in my free time, I'm going to do things that I cannot do down here on Earth. I want to take advantage of this very unique opportunity and unique environment that I'm in.
You talk about your work plan. Tell us maybe a typical day on one of your missions, what you would do.
My last flight went to the International Space Station. We were part of the construction of it, and we had some equipment to add to the outside and broken equipment to replace as well. So we had a series of 3 spacewalks that we needed to conduct. So you might get up that day, and I was one of 2 crew members who helped get our spacewalkers into their suits. So that was a lengthy process where we had to follow our checklist, get them in their suits, close it up, pressurize it, check it out, make sure it was good to go, get them all situated in the airlock, close the hatch to the airlock, do the depressurization procedures, get them out the door, and then I had to go over to the International Space Station and fly the robotic arm because I probably had a spacewalker on the end of the arm for some portions of that spacewalk, so I'd do that with another crew member as well. Meanwhile, while all that's going on, another crew member I'm working with, he's helping to do the transfer of equipment between the two spacecraft, and so he would float by periodically and ask me questions about that. So I'd get to the point where I could stop flying the arm for a moment, and then I would transfer over to talking to him, and we would go through our transfer checklist together and verify that we were doing what was correct, and then you'd focus back on flying the robotic arm again. And then you might wrap up from flying the arm, and then the spacewalkers would come back inside, and I had to get them back out of their suits. And then you go look at the timeline and see what other activities. Typically for me, it was going back over the station and doing more of the transfer operations. So you had to be a good multitasker because you didn't have the luxury usually of just focusing on one thing at a time. You had balls that you were juggling that you had to keep going. And so you had to have the ability to focus on a couple of problems at the same time to keep the plan moving forward.
What was your favorite mission?
All of them. You spend so much time training. Again, the opportunity to be in space, it doesn't happen all that often. So any opportunity you have to be there, you love it. You take full advantage of it. You savor each and every day while you're up there.
Were you ever afraid? And then how did you move through that fear in the moment?
Was I ever afraid as an astronaut? No. By the time you get to that point, particularly having been a Navy helicopter pilot, you've had to wrestle with the fact that you have a career that has a pretty high element of risk. And so you have to develop the ability to deal with that. So as an astronaut, I never was afraid of riding the rocket. It's just way too much fun. I wasn't afraid of being on orbit either. I had full confidence in the people who had prepared our spacecraft for flight. I had full confidence in our mission control team who were responsible for making the decisions about how to handle problems and do that in a safe way. Honestly, the most afraid I've ever been as a Navy helicopter pilot, trying to land my helicopter on the back of a ship at night. I mean, that is a demanding environment. It really brings out the best of you as an aviator. And you have to rely on everybody on board that helicopter to be at the top of their game and to be completely focused on the task of trying to bring your helicopter down to a safe landing on the back of a ship where you have really limited visual cues because it is so dark. I flew in the days of pre-night vision goggles, so we just had to rely on our eyeballs and whatever minimal lighting we had on the back of a ship. So I figured if I could handle that I could handle anything. Because it's really not I think a lot of young kids think that you have to completely eliminate the fear, and that's really not the case. It's learning how to push forward even though you're still feeling that fear. So it's more a matter of controlling that fear and still being able to function in the face of it. And that's why I really liked being a helicopter pilot. So I knew that I was part of a team and I could work with the other people on my team, and together we could support one another and get our mission accomplished.
Oh my goodness, that is so impressive. Wow. I saw on the website that you visit schools.
Yes.
And that must be really fun.
Yes,
and
you never know what the kids are going to ask.
And I'd imagine you're especially inspiring to the young girls who want to get into engineering and technology. So tell us some of the questions that the kids ask.
Well, it just so happened that I was up in Linden on Monday because one of my neighbors has a daughter who's at the middle school at Linden Christian, and I can honestly tell you this is the first time that I have been asked this question, but I was asked if we've ever flown live chickens in space before. And I tried not to laugh because immediately what came to my mind was the poor chicken in the animal enclosure module with feathers and, let's be frank, chicken poop floating everywhere. And I was thinking, oh, that really would not go over well. So that was kind of a fun question. Like, no, we've never flown a live chicken. Not sure how the chicken would do. Don't think the chicken would like to be floating around. And then we started to think about it a little bit more. I'm like, I don't know how the chicken would be able to nest, because I don't know how you'd keep the nesting material down on the bottom of the cage. You'd have to think about how you would restrain it and still have it feel natural to the chicken. So that was a fun question.
Oh my goodness. But animals have been in space before.
Yes. In fact, right now on the International Space Station, they just had a resupply module docked there, the Cygnus capsule built by Orbital ATK, and they transferred some flatworms, I believe. Worms have flown quite a bit in space to just again study what happens to an organism when it's in the absence of gravity. How will it continue to function and develop? There's an aquatic research facility in the Japanese laboratory module, so I don't remember the type of fish, but there's some fish on board that they're trying to see how they'll do in the absence of gravity. Do they orient themselves the same way? Do they have to use another cue, like light perhaps, to figure out how to stay up or down? Spiders have flown before to see how a spider will spin a web without gravity. I think the spider was called Arabella, and the first web she spun did not look symmetrical at all. But she had an opportunity to do another one, and she had figured out the lack of gravity.
Oh my goodness.
And that web was much more symmetrical. So that's what's fascinating to the scientists, is to see that adaptation by the organism. Caterpillars have flown before, and they did turn into butterflies. Honeybees have flown as well, and they were able to develop their hive, and lots of mice and rats have flown.
That's so fascinating. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you is about private industry and SpaceX, for example, and maybe talk about their relationship with NASA, and then also how soon do you think they'll be able to take a group of humans up there for private pay? And I don't know how much that would cost, but...
Well, I think what a lot of people don't remember or even know is the fact that NASA has always worked with outside companies to build their rockets and their spacecraft. It was rarely the NASA workforce that would build the entire spacecraft. And so NASA, from its inception, had the role of figuring out what it was going to do next, like, okay, let a reusable wing vehicle to go to low Earth orbit. And then NASA would specify what that spacecraft needed to be able to do, what are called requirements. It might have some more specific requirements about some design elements, say, for example, the type of life support systems. But it was left to these companies, these contractors, to figure out a design that would meet those requirements. What was different in the early years of NASA, and even up through this space shuttle program, is that the contractor then turned the vehicle, the spacecraft, over to NASA, and NASA owned it and operated it. What NASA's doing differently in the space station program with companies like SpaceX, Orbital ATK, and eventually Boeing, is that the requirements are still issued by NASA. The commercial companies are still building the spacecraft, but they now own the spacecraft and they operate it. NASA's still responsible for the overall mission. So Orbital ATK just a couple days ago launched their Cygnus resupply capsule to the station. It docked to the station yesterday. Cygnus is still being managed, operated by Orbital ATK, but the overall mission responsibilities of transferring all the supplies on board to the station, that's NASA's responsibility. So Boeing and SpaceX are working with NASA to develop human-rated spacecraft capable of taking astronauts to and from the International Space Station. So I suspect they'll have some probably unmanned test flights sometime next year, followed by crewed flights in 2019. Now there's another side to that, which is called, some people like to call it commercial space flight, space tourism. Think of Virgin Galactic, owned by Sir Richard Branson. They are trying to send paying passengers up on suborbital flights. Unfortunately for them, they learned the challenges of flying in the space environment in a very painful way. They had an unsuccessful test flight a few years ago, which killed one of their test pilots, and so that set them back significantly. And honestly, they're quick to say, we no longer have a timeline. We're just going to do the work that's necessary. We're going to take the time that's necessary to make sure we get this right. Are they a year away, 2 years away? It's hard to tell. I suspect they're more like 2 years, maybe 3 years away from doing suborbital test flights with paying passengers. But the commercial companies will get there. Just like the early days of aviation, fits and starts, lots of crashes, unfortunately. They'll get it right. They'll figure things out. They'll learn those painful lessons. They'll take the knowledge of what's been done before, because we have been flying humans in space for 50 years, so there is a bedrock of knowledge, and NASA's made a point of trying to transfer that to the commercial companies and work with them as well to help them with these activities. We will eventually see spaceflight become routine. Are we at the realm of Star Trek and Star Wars? No. Decades away from that. But we will get to the early stages of people being able to fly in space. And I think we'll do that probably within the next 5 or 10 years.
Wow. That's incredible to hear from you. You mentioned Star Wars and Star Trek, and I wanted just to kind of bring our conversation full circle to childhood, and you talked about watching the Apollo landing and being called to that. And did you watch futuristic movies like Star Wars and Star Trek?
Well, for me, being fairly old now, my older brother and I watched every episode of the original Star Trek. So when you think about when that show came out, the quality of the set, of the bridge that they developed for Enterprise, it was unlike anything we'd seen before. And it was pretty futuristic. But it made us want to see that happen. So it was inspiring, it planted seeds, and so yes, that was very impactful. It gave us a glimpse of what things could be like. 2001 Space Odyssey ranks right up there as well, because that was a pretty far out movie for its time when you think about it, unlike anything that we'd typically seen on the screen before. So yeah, there were things out there to continually inspire you and give you a glimpse of what things could be like.
I met Mr. Spock when I was 3 in New York. And boy, he was really tall and intimidating, but yeah, I loved that show too, and The Next Generation. But as we close, I have a little gift for you. Okay, so this is a Yoda shirt.
I do like Yoda.
Oh, good. And it's got
words of wisdom.
The wisdom sayings on it.
Oh, very
yes.
good. Oh,
so
very fun. You're very thoughtful to do that.
So we've got, of course, May the Force be with you.
Yes.
Do or do not. There's no try.
I like that line.
Fear is the path to the dark side, and always in motion is the future. So
yes.
I am super grateful that you're here. I've been so excited. My family and the film crew, they know how excited I've been. So
very fun.
Really appreciative.
Like I said, I do like Yoda, not mainly because I'm about his size. That will be great.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Bellingham Voices. We'll see you next time, and take care.